Hi, I'm Christy Shriver, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. This week, we continue our discussion of the man who helped create the world's understanding of beautiful and enchanting Scotland. Last episode, we highlighted the differences between the Highlands and the Lowlands, the Trossachs, or the lake region between the two, where he set the poem Lady of the Lake. And although he made Highland culture iconic, it's not the only region of Scotland featured in his work. And today we will feature a piece of shorter fiction that highlights a different part of Scotland, and that would be the Border region. That's the lush green area that borders England. And Sir Walter Scott, by the time he became a baronet in 1820 and was the most famous novelist in the world, he was committed to using his remarkable influence to do whatever was in his power to elevate the culture and the image of the people from backward, ignorant, and even feral to glamorous and intriguing and even magical. You know, in some ways, the story of how that happened feels like a cultural coup. This episode will tell that story, how Scott found lost treasure, how he reintroduced bagpipes into modern Scottish culture, and got men who 20 years previously would not have been caught dead in a kilt to wear them at a state-sponsored banquet. And beyond that, we will also introduce his most popular piece of short fiction, Wandering Willie's Tale. Now, Christy, I've read that it is one of the most carefully and well-crafted pieces of short fiction in the English language. I mean, why? And really before that, let me ask an even more basic question. What is a tale? And how is a tale different from a short story? And are the terms interchangeable?
Well, yeah, a lot of questions there.
Yeah, I know. I'm probably a lot.
You know, last episode we talked about how in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, the kind of things people were reading was different than what, we read today. People read verse. Another word for that would be poetry. And good poets were the equivalent of rock stars, or maybe a better analogy would be rap stars today. It was a popular genre and it was very respected. Women were reading another form of fiction called novels, and these were lesser forms of fiction, womanish, if you want to know what they thought of them. I think the closest equivalent would be, the respect we give to daytime soap operas today. They were not taken seriously. Serious people did not write novels. But Scott, mostly out of financial necessity, took to writing in that genre. He was going to write novels his way. He would make them manly, to use the gendered language of the day. We would say he made them cool. And his plan was to lean on, for inspiration, the oral narratives and the adventure stories of the Scottish people. And so we see this evolution in writing, starting with the epic poems, and Scott introduces this concept of the adventure novel. But the short story was not invented. In 1827, Scott published what today has been called the first short story in the English language. That short story is titled The Two Drovers. This would be another genre, and it would be explored not by Scott himself, but by another writer who we may know, Charles Dickens. But The Two Drovers, although a great story, is not what we're going to read today. We're going to read an earlier one that's not really considered a short story at all, because it's part of a larger work. The story that we're going to read was written in 1824. It's part of a larger novel called Red Gauntlet. And technically, Wandering Willie's Tale isn't a short story. It's a tale. T-A-L-E, not T-A-I-L, like dogs have and wag. There are differences between a story and a tale. A story involves a protagonist who pursues a specific goal. Short stories have discernible themes and there's a clear, arch in the narrative, but tales don't have to be like that. They're just a recounting of a series of events, and they may or may not have a goal at all. They're associated with the oral tradition of storytelling, which is how Scott sets up this one. Scotland to this day has a strong tradition of storytelling, and Scott demonstrates this by having this whole tale written in Scots. It's not written in English. Let me explain what that even is. I have always thought that Scots was a dialect of English. But when we were in Scotland and we had the opportunity to discuss Sir Walter Scott and Robert Burns's work with Nancy, a Scottish English teacher, I had to stand down and was corrected. Scots is not a dialect of English. It is a distinct language, although closely related. In fact, so close that we can understand each other for the most part, but that not entirely. But it's an important distinction. Scot is not substandard English. In fact, the reason Robert Burns so often wrote in Scots was to make that very important political statement. Now, we don't see Walter Scott making a political statement with his use of Scots, but in the larger work, Red Gauntlet, he switches languages in order to tell a ghost story. He has a very specific narrative purpose for doing so, and it's not to make the teller of the story sound country, like you might think if you're an American, and if you think of Scots, like we think of, Southern English or something like that, because it isn't anything like that. In the case of this tale, we have a ghost story told by a blind fiddler named Willie, who recounts to another character by the name of Darcy Latimer a story he knows of his grandfather. Now, the word for grandfather in Scots is guidesire. That's a word you'll hear more than once when we read.
So, just to be clear, Sir Walter Scott wrote a novel in English titled Red Gauntlet, and inside this novel is a tale told by one of the characters to the other characters, and this tale is written in a different language called Scots that is not English, but we're supposed to be able to understand it. So let me summarize. Sir Walter Scott is writing in Scots in Scotland.
That is correct.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm on the right page.
And Willie doesn't speak English. He speaks Scots and tells the ghost story in Scots. It's unusual, and I'll be up front, and I have to be up front. I don't speak Scots, and it's not going to sound right when we read it. I'm American. We're both American. But I don't think Sir Walter Scott would be offended. He expected his readers to perhaps not speak Scots. Understanding it as such is part of the adventure of reading the story. He's exposing us to something maybe we wouldn't otherwise know anything about. So please know that we're not trying to be disrespectful. We do want to honor the work, but we literally cannot pronounce these in the proper way. You can hear it in the proper way. You can find a proper version on YouTube, and there are people there who speak this very eloquently that do speak Scots. I think it is also ironic, as you pointed out, that Scott is writing in Scots, but the language and the person have nothing to do with each other. That is a coincidence.
By the way, I wish I had the Scottish accents that we heard when we were in Edinburgh. That would be awesome. But
I know.
Scott was interested in preserving all aspects of Scotland's history and culture, and so he introduced us to the stories of the Highlands and the Lowlands, as well as the border country where he was originally from. And many of the stories are inspired by actual legends and versions of true stories that were floating around the countryside. Willie's tale is specifically based on the legends surrounding Sir Robert Grierson, otherwise known as Cruel Lag. Grierson persecuted Covenanters during a period of Scottish history known as the Killing Time, specifically 1679 to 1688.
It's terrible when they call it killing time.
No good is going to come from that. And it lasted 9 years, and compared to modern genocides, it was not quite as deadly, but it was bad enough to be distinctive, and it was political, and there was more to it. But the simple version, was this: if a person didn't acknowledge the king as head of the church, Grierson took it upon himself as a local baron to kill you. There's one story where he would put people in barrels with spikes and roll them down hills. And he is so hated that when we visited Dumfries, our friend David Hiddleston, who's from the area, shared with us that to this day, from time to time, he will go by Grierson's grave and spit on it, and sometimes worse than that.
What does it say about you when you lived your life 300 years ago and people are still spitting on you? Switching subjects, but only slightly. One important legend that really intrigued Scott and has intrigued thousands, including me, since him, has nothing to do with the killing time, but has something to do with the Scottish monarchy. The monarchy isn't referenced in our tale, but this tale surrounding the crown jewels is so important to the story of Scotland as a whole. Gary, I think we would be amiss if we don't introduce or finish our discussion of Scott talking about this mysterious tale.
That would be about the crown jewels of Scotland. Well, first of all, they consisted of a scepter, which is supposed to have been a gift from the Pope, the sword of state, and a crown. They were first used at the coronation of 9-month-old Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1543, which is difficult to imagine because the baby couldn't really wear them. But after her, they were used at the coronation of her son, James VI, also known as James I. I want to point out James VI, if you're talking about the Scottish crown, and James I, if you're talking about the English crown, is confusing.
But it's the same guy, James.
It's the same guy. And on down the line until 1651, but they were last worn by Charles II at his coronation at Scone. At this point in Scottish history, a man by the name of Oliver Cromwell invaded Scotland and wanted to destroy the crown jewels of Scotland like he had destroyed the crown jewels of England. People knew this was coming, so in an attempt to preserve them, they were hidden. Eventually, they were hidden inside Edinburgh Castle, but they were kept hidden so long that they got lost somewhere inside the castle, which sounds crazy, but you have to know
What'd you do with the crown?
Yes, well, the Edinburgh Castle is enormous. I mean, it's really a small city. I was surprised by how big it was when we visited. I mean, it's over 400,000 square feet, and it's the 10th largest castle in the world. I mean, it's a complex with multiple buildings, a church, a prison, and so Scott, using his popularity as a leverage, requested and got permission from George IV, who at the time was the Prince of Wales, to look for the crown jewels, and on February 4th, 1818, he found them.
Well, where were they, and how did he find them?
Well, he didn't find them at first. This would be a good Netflix series. I mean, they looked everywhere, but they couldn't find them, and he might never have found them except for a man by the name of George Smith. Smith wrote Sir Walter Scott a letter claiming to know where the jewels were. He claimed to have hidden them himself. So Scott met with Smith. Smith told him that there was a secret chamber within the walls of the castle. And Smith was very specific. Scott went to the spot. He broke through the wall that had been built there, and he found a chest with the crown jewels inside. As Indiana Jones as that might seem, it's actually the truth. And as you might imagine, George IV was very impressed. He granted Scott this barony for his contribution. And, this is a big deal, and it's why he's not Walter Scott, but Sir Walter Scott. Besides the title of baronet, he also gave him the opportunity to be in charge of the royal visit. And George IV wanted to come to Scotland. That was a place that no British monarch had visited since 1650, and this is 1820, almost 200 years, okay? So Scott was in charge, and he masterminded a grand display, and it was huge. Over 300,000 people came to Edinburgh for the occasion. I mean, that's 1/7 of the entire population of the country. And Scott had already charmed the king with stories about his connections to Scotland. He had absolutely assured the king that his royal connection to the Scottish throne would be accepted as legitimate and that he would be well received. And Scott went so far as talking the king into wearing a tartan kilt, which is incredible. A tartan kilt, ever since the Battle of Culloden, was illegal to wear. They would literally send you off to the Caribbean and the Americas to be a slave for wearing one. And here was the monarch wearing one. I mean, that was bold. And Scott commissioned the production of what would be an equivalent of $150,000 worth of red and gold tartan. That's the plaid material we think of when we think of Scottish kilts. And that's the material that would have got you in trouble. And he decorated everything with it, and King George was all in. There's a surviving sketch of what he looked like, which I think is kind of funny today. George IV was about 5'2", And he was about, 1.57 meters. And historians tell us that he weighed in at around 280 pounds with a waist of 51 inches. Add to the fact that he chose to wear bright pink silk stockings under his kilt to conceal his varicose veins. And let me throw this in. If that wasn't enough for an image, he wore this kilt 6 inches above his knee. So we're talking a mini skirt, basically, is what we're looking at.
He's not a thin man. Well, I have to be honest. If I had heard that was in the cards and I could see that in person, I would totally have gone down to check it out.
And King George was all about it, as was the whole country. His tour made him and wearing kilts cool again. There was a procession down what today we would call the Royal Mile, and that's the mile walk from Edinburgh Castle to the official royal residence, which isn't the castle, but it's a place called Holyrood. Among other things, he visited St. Giles Church, which is the Church of Scotland. He attended a theater performance of Rob Roy, and he greeted everyone. The visit of the king was a huge deal. The Royal Company of Archers were his bodyguards, and they made such an impression on the king that they were formally appointed as the sovereign's bodyguards in Scotland, and they still are to this day. From then on, the kilt was the thing. Not only was it no longer illegal, but after this visit, it just blew up in popularity, and Scotland would never again be thought of as a barren wilderness full of uncivilized natives. 15 years after his visit, Queen Victoria would purchase Balmoral and solidify the connection between the royals and Scotland. So what Scott did to redeem Scotland is amazing.
Well, and 2 years after that, we get the book, out of which our story emerges. Scott's moment of glory, although he did not know it at the time, was about to be over. In 1825, for a bunch of different reasons, Scott's publisher and business partner John Ballantyne went bankrupt. Scott wouldn't do that himself. He made the decision that instead of going bankrupt, he would pay back every one of his creditors, and he owed over 100,000 pounds. Roughly, I've seen different estimates, but we're looking at 10 million pounds on today's money, depending on the inflation calculator that you use. So he began to write again from morning to night. He wrote. He had a stroke in 1830. He still wrote. He died in 1832 at age 61, having paid off over half of his debt. 4 years later, after his death, a competition was launched inviting designs to celebrate the man that Scotland loved so much. We talked about it last week, but that monument is the image that will greet you when you enter the city today. So, having known the story of Sir Walter Scott, let us read his tale, Wandering Willie.
For sure. So let's set up the story. The setting is the last 17th century in the period known as the Killing Time. And you said the story is narrated not by the narrator of the book, but by Willie, who's a character.
Right. Nathaniel Hawthorne would say a few years after this story was written, and I want to quote Hawthorne here. He said this: "If a writer cannot believe his own ghost story, he had better leave the task to someone else." And that's what Scott did. He wanted us to believe the story you're about to hear. Willie is a believer. For Willie, this happened. And Willie will make us believe that we believe it happened too.
And did it happen, or did Scott just make it up?
Well, that's a good question. There's a way to read the story, and of course, it's the most obvious way to read the story about a man named Stevie Stinson who went down to hell and came back again. And that sounds like a supernatural thing to do. So if you're a scientifically minded person or a non-religious person, you would say no. But Steenie, who is telling the story to Willie, really believes that he did go to hell. However, at the time that Steenie went down to hell, he was also drunk. So did he imagine it? Willie tells us that from his perspective, that we should keep our minds open. Scott was asked about this tale, and he asked where he got it, and he said this, and let me quote Scott: I have heard in my youth some such wild tales as that have been placed in the mouth of the blind fiddler, and of which I think the hero was Sir Robert Grierson of Lag, the famous persecutor. So Scott admits to basing the character of Sir Robert Redgauntlet off of the person Sir Robert Grierson, and there is a real legend of one of Grierson's lessees obtaining a receipt from him after his death. So, did it happen? Let's read Scott's version and decide for ourselves. You ready?
Let's give it a Scottish try.
Okay, this is going to be a challenge. Ye men have heard of Sir Robert Redgauntlet of that ilk, who lived in these parts before the dear years. The country will lang mind him, and our fathers used to draw breath thick if ever they heard him named. He was out with the Highlandmen in Montrose's time, and again he was in the hills with Glencairn in the 1652, and saw when King Charles II came in what was in sick favour as the Lord of Redgauntlet. He was knighted on London court with the king's own sword, and being a red-hot prelatist, he came down here rampaging like a lion, with commissions of lieutenancy, and of lunacy for what I can tell, to put down the Whigs and the coveters in the country. Wild work they made of it, for the Whigs were as dour as the Cavaliers were fierce, and it was what would first tire of the other. Redgauntlet was I for the strong hand, and his name is kind of wide in the country, as Claverhouses or Tamdales, Glen, nor Dargle, nor mountain, nor cave could hide the pure hill folk when Redgauntlet was out with bugle and bloodhound after them, as if they had been some money deer. And troth, when they found them, they didn't have muckle mair ceremony than a Highlander with a roebuck. It was just, will you take the test? If not, make ready, present, fire. And there lay the recusant. Far and wide was Sir Robert hated and feared. Men thought he had a direct compact with Satan, that he was proof against steel, that bullets hopped off his buff coat like hailstones from a hearth, and he had a mirror that would turn a hair on the side of Carafrigans, and muckle to the same purpose, of whilk mair anon. The best blessing they word of him was, Dale scope with Redgauntlet. He wasn't a bad master to his own folk, though, and he was real nice liked by his tenants, and as for the lackeys and troopers that rode around with him in the persecutions, as the Whigs called those killing times, why, they would have drunken themselves blind to his health at any time. Now you are to kind my guide sire lived on Redgauntlet's ground. They called the place Primrose Knowe. We had lived on the ground and under the Redgauntlet since the riding days, and long before. It was a pleasant bit, and I think the air was cooler and fresher there than anywhere else in the country. It's a deserted place now, and I sat on the broken doorstep 3 days since and was glad I couldn't see the plight the place was in. But that's a wide of the mark. There dwelt my guide sire, Steenie Stinson, a rambling, rattling chell who had been in his young days and could play real well on the pipes. He was famous at hoopers and girders, and a Cumberland couldn't touch him at jockey Latin, and he had the finest finger for the back lilt between Berwick and Carlisle. The like of Steenie wasn't the sort that would make the Whigs, and so he became a Tory, as they called it, which we now call Jacobites, just out of kind of a necessity, that he might belong to some side or another. He had nae ill will to the Whig bodies, and liked little to see the blood run through, being obliged to follow Sir Robert in hunting and hoisting, watching and warding. He saw muckle mischief, and maybe did some that he couldn't avoid. Now Steenie was kind of a favourite with his master, and kind of the folk about the castle, and was often sent for to play the pipes when there was merriment. Old Dougal MacCallum, the butler, that had followed Sir Robert through guide and ill and thick and thin and pool and stream, was specifically fond of the pipes, and gave my guide sire his guide word will the lard, for Dougal could turn his master round his finger. Well, round came the revolution, and it had like to have broken the hearts both of Dougal and his master. But the change was not altogether great as they feared, and other folk thought, for the Whigs made an uncowering what they would do with their old enemies. and in special with Sir Robert Redgauntlet. But there was an o'ermony, great folks, dipped in the same way to make a spick and span new world. So Parliament passed it over easy, and Sir Robert, bating that he was held to hunting foxes instead of Covenanters, remained just the man he was. His revel was as loud and his haw as well lit as ever it had been, though maybe he lacked the fines of the nonconformists that used to come to stock his larder and cellar, for it is certain he began to be keener about the rents than his tenants used to find him before. And they behooved to be prompt to the rent day, or else the Lord wasn't pleased, and he was sick and awesome body that nobody cared to anger him, for the oaths he swore, and the rage that he used to get into, and the looks that he put on men, made them think him a devil incarnate. Gary, can you understand the Scots?
I think so for the most part. Let me paraphrase it, put it this way. Redgauntlet is a bad dude. But since there was a change in politics, he's quit hunting and killing Covenanters, and he started hunting foxes. And so it sounds like Steenie's a likable guy who everybody likes to be around.
Yes. I'm going to skip a couple paragraphs of the politics, and let's jump to the place where Steenie has to go to Redgauntlet Castle because he hasn't paid his rent. Scott says at this, "Well, my guide sire was nae manager. Know that he was a very great misguider, but he hadn't the saving gift." I know a couple people that haven't the saving gift. "And he got 2 terms rent in the rear. He didn't have his money, so he went around to all of his acquaintances and borrowed money. Finally, he shows up at the castle to pay his late rent to Redgauntlet."
Away trots my guide sire to Redgauntlet Castle with a heavy purse and a light heart, glad to be out of the Lord's danger. Well, the first thing he learned at the castle was that Sir Robert had fretted himself into a fit of the gout because he did no appear before 12 o'clock. It wasn't altogether for the sake of money, Dougal thought, but because he didn't like to part with it in guide sire after the grund. Dougal was glad to see Steenie and brought him into the great oak parlour, and there sat the Lord, his leesome lane, excepting there he had beside him a great ill-favoured jackanape that was a special pet of his. A cankered beast it was, and money an ill-natured trick it played. Ill to please it was, and easily angered. It ran about the hall castle chattering and growling and pinching and biting folk, especially after ill weather or disturbance in the state. Sir Robert called it Major Weird, after the warlock that was burnt, and few folk liked either the name or the conditions of the creature. They thought there was something in it by ordinary, and my guide sire was not just easy in mind when the door shut on him, and he saw himself in the room with naebody but the Lord, Dougal MacCallum, and the Major, a thing that hadn't chanced to him before. Sir Robert sat, or I should say lay, in a great armchair with his grand velvet gown and his feet on a cradle, for he had both gout and gravel, and his face looked as gash and ghastly as Satan's. Major Weir sat opposite to him in a red-laced coat and the laird's wig on his head, and I, as Sir Robert gurned with pain, the jackanape gurned too, like a sheep's head between a pair of tangs. An ill-farred, fearsome couple they were.
You know, I think we need to make clear that Major Weir is not a person, but a monkey. Mm-hmm. Major Weir is an evil monkey, and he's freaking everybody out.
An evil monkey. All
yes. Right. The laird's buff coat was hung on a pin behind him, and his broadsword and his pistols within reach, for he kept it at the old fashion of having the weapons ready, and a horse saddled day and night, just as he used to do when he was able to leap on horseback and sway after any up the hill folk he could get spearings of. Some said it was for fear of the Whigs taking vengeance, but I judge it was just his old custom. He wasn't going to out-fear anything. The rental book with its black cover and brass claps was lying beside him, and a book of skullduggery sayings was put betwixt the leaves to keep it open at the place where it bore evidence against the good man of Primrose Knowe, as behind the hand with his mails and duties. Sir Robert gave my guide sire a look as if he would have withered his heart in his bosom. You men ken he had a way of bending his brows that men saw the visible mark of a horseshoe in his forehead, deep in it, as if it had been stamped there.
Are you come light-handed, you son of a tomb whistle, said Sir Robert. Sounds as if you are.
My guide, sire, was as good a countenance as he could put on, made a leg, and placed the bag of money on the table with a dash like a man that does something clever. The Lord drew it to him hastily. Is all here, Steenie man? Your honor will find it right, said my guide, sire.
Here, Dougal, said the laird, gie Steenie a tass of brandy till I count the siller and write the receipt.
Well, they weren't a reel out of the room when Sir Robert gave a yeller that guard the castle rock. Back ran Dougal, and a flew the liveryman, yell on yell, guide the lard, ilk and mare awful than the other. My guide, sire, knew not whether to stand or flee, but he ventured back into the parlor where I was gone hurdy-gurdy, nobody to say come in or go out. Terribly the Lord roared for cold water to his feet and wine to cool his throat.
Hell, 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 and its flames,
was all the word in his mouth. They brought him water, and when they plunged his swollen feet into the tub, he cried out it was burning, and the folk say it did bubble and sparkle like a seething cauldron. He flung the cup at Dougal's head and said he had given him blood instead of burgundy, and sure enough, the lash washed the clotted blood off the carpet, and nace the day. The jackanape they call Major Weir, it gibbered and cried as if it was mocking its master. My guide-sire's head was like to turn. He forgot both silver and receipt, and downstairs he banged, but as he ran, the shrieks came fainter and fainter. There was a deep-drawn, shivering groan, and word gone through the castle that the Lord was dead.
So I guess we've established that Red Gauntlet was so evil that even his feet would steam in water when you pour water on him. I mean, he's reflecting hellfire or something like that.
Yes, and all that blood, exactly. And he's died before Steenie could get a receipt to prove that he had paid his back rent. And this is Steenie's problem, because Red Gauntlet's son, John Red Gauntlet, is a lawyer and is coming down from Edinburgh to settle his father's affairs. There was only one witness who could prove that he paid his rent, and that was Dougal the butler, who was in the room. However, Dougal has his own problem. Every night he hears Sir Robert playing this whistle, the one they used to summon him with. Dougal decides he must go to where the dead body is laying and see what the whistle noise is about. He grabs his old buddy Hitchin, and they go to see Sir Robert's body. When midnight came and the house was quiet as the grave, sure enough, the silver whistle sounded as sharp and shrill as if Sir Robert was blowing it. And he got up the 12 awed serving men and tottered into the room where the dead man lay. Hutchins saw enough at the first glance, for there were torches in the room, which showed him the foul fiend in his ain shape sitting on the Lord's coffin, or he cooped, as if he had been dead. He cannot tell how long he lay in a trance at the door, but when he gathered himself, he cried on his neighbor, and getting no answer, raised the house. When Dougal was found, lying dead, within 2 steps of the bed where his master's coffin was placed. As for the whistle, it was gone, anes and I. But many a time was it heard at the top of the house on the bartizan, and among the old chimneys and turrets where the howlets have their nests. Sir John hushed the matter up, and the funeral passed over without mair boggle work.
So now there is no evidence that Steenie has paid his rent.
Exactly. And every tenant is being summoned one by one to give an account before Sir John. Let's read the conversation between Sir John and Steenie, who Sir John calls Stephen. Here he opened the fatal volume. I have heard of a thing they call Doomsday Book. I am clear it has been a rental of back-ganging tenants.
Stephen, said Sir John, still in the same soft, sleek tone of voice. Stephen Steenson, ye are down here for a year's rent behind the hand, due at last term.
Please, your honor, Sir John, I paid it to your father.
Ye took a receipt then, doubtless, Stephen, and can you produce it?
Indeed, I hadn't time, and it was like your honor, for nae sooner had I set down the silver, and just as his honor Sir Robert that gone, drew it till he him to count it and write out the receipt, he was taken with the pains, and that removed him.
That was unlucky, said Sir John after a pause, but ye may be paid it in the presence of somebody. I want but a talus qualis evidence, Stephen. I would go over strictly to work with no poor man.
Truth, Sir John, there was nobody in the room but Dougal MacCallum, the butler, but as your honor kens, he has unfollowed his old master.
Well, very unlucky again, Stephen, said Sir John, without altering his voice a single note. The man to whom ye paid the money is dead, and the man who witnessed the payment is dead too, and the silver which should have been to the fore is neither seen nor heard tell of in the repositories. How am I to believe this?
I dunna ken, your honor, but there is a bit memorandum note of the very coins. For God help me, I had to borrow out of 20 purses, and I am sure that ilka man there set down will take his grit oath for what purpose I borrowed the money.
I have little doubt that ye borrowed the money, Steenie. It is the payment that I want to have proof of.
The silver man about the house, Sir John, and since your honor never got it, and his honor that was canna have taken it with him, maybe some of the family may have seen it.
We will examine a servant, Stephen, but that is but reasonable.
But lackey and lass and page and groom all denied stoutly that they had ever seen such a bag of money as my guide sire described. What saw wire he had unluckily not mentioned to any living soul of them his purpose of paying his rent. Equine had noticed something under his arm, but she took it for the pipes. Sir Redgauntlet ordered the servants out of the room, and then said to my guide sire,
Now, Steenie, ye see ye have fair play, and as I have little doubt ye can better where to find the silver than any other body, I beg in fair terms, and for your own sake, that you will end this farcery. For Stephen, you may pay for it or flit. So I am, Stephen, said his honor, and so are all the folks in his house, I hope. But if there be a knave amongst us, it must be he that tells a story he cannot prove. He paused and then added sternly, If I understand your trick, sir, you want to take advantage of some malicious reports concerning things in this family, and particularly respecting my father's sudden death, thereby to cheat me out of the money and perhaps take away my character by insinuating that I have received the rent I am demanding. Where do you suppose this money to be? I insist upon knowing.
My guide sire saw everything look so muckle against him that he grew nearly desperate. However, he shifted from one foot to another, looked to every corner of the room, and made no answer.
Speak out, sir,
said the lord, assuming a look of his father's, a very particular one which he had when he was angry. It seemed as if the wrinkles of his frown made that self-same fearful shape of a horseshoe in the middle of his brow.
Speak out, sir. I will know your thoughts. Do you suppose that I have this money?
Far be it from me to say so.
Do you charge any of my people with having taken it?
I would be loath to charge them that may be innocent, but if there be any one that is guilty, I have no proof.
Somewhere the money must be, if there is a word of truth in your story, said Sir John. I ask where you think it is, and I demand a correct answer.
In hell, if you will have my thought of it, said my guide sire, driven to extremity. In hell with your father, his jackanape, and his silver whistle. Down the stairs he ran, for the parlour was nae place for him with such a word, and he heard the lord swearing blood and wounds behind him as fast as ever did Sir Robert, and roaring for the bailey and the baron officer. So Steenie goes and tries to borrow more money, but that was a fail. So, in desperation, he walks through the woods back home. However, on his way, he stops and drinks up what they call a munchin of brandy. It's important to know that Steenie hadn't eaten all day. Tibby, the lady who gave him the brandy, told him to eat something with it, but he wouldn't. Instead, he made 2 toasts as he threw down the brandy. Let me read these toasts as Sir Walter Scott wrote them. The first was the memory of Sir Robert Redgauntlet. May he never lie quiet in his grave till he had righted his poor bond tenant. The second was a health to man's enemy. if he would but get him back the pack of silver or tell him where it came from, and he saw the hell world was like to regard him as a thief and a cheat, and took that word than ever the ruin of his house and home.
And if assume that man's enemy is a devil, he's asking the devil to get his silver back?
I think that's what that curse is. On he rode, little caring where. It was a dark night turned, and the trees made it yet darker, and he let the beast take its own road through the woods, when all of a sudden, from tired and wearied that it was before, the nag began to spring and flee and stand, that my guide sire could hardly keep the saddle. Upon the work, a horseman suddenly riding up beside him.
That's a metal beast of yours, friend. Will you sell him? So saying, he touched the horse's neck with his riding wand, and it fell into its old hi-ho of a stumbling trot. But his spunk's soon out of him, I think, continued the stranger, and that is like many a man's courage that thinks he would do great things.
My guide sire scarce listened to this, but spurred his horse with, "Giddy up you go, friend!" But it's like the stranger was one that doesn't lightly yield his point, for ride as Steenie liked, he was I behind him at the self-same pace. At last my guide sire, Steenie Stilson, grew half angry, and to say the half-truth, half-afraid, "What is it that you want from me, friend?" he said. "If ye be a robber, I have no money. If ye be a little man wanting company, I have neither heart nor mirth or speaking, and if ye want to kent down the road, I scarce can myself."
"If you will tell me your grief," said the stranger, "I am one that, though I have been sared miscarried in the world, am the only hand for helping my friends."
So my guide sire, to ease his ain heart, mair than from any hope of help, told him the story from beginning to end.
"It's a hard pinch," said the stranger, "but I think I can help you."
"If you could lend me the money, sir, and take a long day, I can nae other help on earth."
"But there may be some under the earth," said the stranger. "Come, I'll be frank with you. I could lend you the money on bond, but you would maybe scruple my terms. Now I can tell you that your old laird is disturbed in his grave by your curses and the wailing of your family, and if you dare venture to go see him, he will give you the receipt."
My guide sire's hair stood on end at this proposal, but he thought his companion might be some humorsome child that was trying to frighten him, and might end with lending him the money. Besides, he was bald with brandy and desperate with distress, and he said he had courage to go to the gate of hell and a step farther for that receipt. The stranger laughed. Well, they rode on through the thickest of the wood, when all of a sudden the horse stopped at the door of a great house, but that he knew the place was 10 miles off. My father would have thought he was back at Red Gauntlet Castle. They rode into the outer courtyard, through the muckle falding yets and the old portcullis, and the whole front of the house was lighted, and there were pipes and fiddles and as much dancing and durray within as used to be at Sir Robert's house at Pace and Yule with such high seasons. They lap off, and my guide sire, as seemed to him, fastened his horse to the very ring he had tied to that morning when he went to wait on Sir John. "God," said my guide sire, "if Sir Robert's death be but a dream?" He knocked on the door just as he was wont, and his old acquaintance, Dougal MacCallum, just after his wont too, came to open the door, and said,
"Piper Steenie, are ye there, lad? Sir Robert has been crying for you."
My guide sire was like a man in a dream. He looked for the stranger, but he was gone for the time. At last he tried to say, "Well, Duggar Dryover, are you living? I thought you had been dead."
"Never fash yourself with me," said Dougal, "but look to yourself. And see you take nothing from anybody here, neither meat, drink, or silver, except the receipt that is in your hand."
So saying, he led the way out through the halls and trances that were well kin to my guide sire, and into the old oak parlor, and there was as much singing of profane songs and birling of red wine and blasphemy skullduggery as ever had been in Red Gauntlet Castle when it was at its blithest. I'm going to skip a part in the description of the castle, because we're going to find out that these are full of bad guys that have all been friends of Sir Robert, and they're down there partying, drinking, and causing havoc. Sir Robert Redgauntlet, in the midst of all this fearful riot, cried with a voice like thunder on Steenie Piper to come to the board head where he was sitting, his legs stretched out before him and swathed up with flannel, with his holster pistols beside him, where the great broadsword rested against his chair, just as my guide sire had seen him the last time he was on earth. The very cushion for the jacanope was close to him, but the creature itself was not there. It wasn't its hour, it's likely, for he had heard them say as he came forward, "Is not the Major come yet?" And another answered, "The jackanape will be here between the morn." And when my guide sire came forward, Sir Robert, or his ghost, or the devil in his likeness, said,
"Well, Piper, have you settled with my son for the year's rent?"
With much ado, my father got breath to say that Sir John would not settle without his honour's receipt.
"Ye shall have that for a tune of the pipes, Steenie," said the appearance of Sir Robert. "Play us up Well Hodled Lucky."
Now this was a tune my guide sire learned frae a warlock, and had heard it when they were worshipping Satan at their meetings. And my guide sire had sometimes played it at the ranting suppers in Redgauntlet Castle, but never very willingly, and now he grew cold at the very name of it, and said for excuse that he hadn't his pipes with him.
"MacCallum, ye limb of Beelzebub," said the fearful Sir Robert, "bring Steenie the pipes that I'm keeping for him."
MacCallum brought a pair of pipes, might have served the piper of Donald of the Isles, but he gave my guide sire a nudge as he offered them, and looking secretly and closely, Steenie saw that the chanter was of steel and heated to a white heat, so he had fair warning not to trust his fingers with it. So he excused himself again and said he was faint and frightened, and he had not wind enough to fill the bag.
"Then, ye man, eat and drink, Steenie," said the figure, "for we do little else here, and it's ill speaking between a foul man and a fasting."
Now there were the words that the bloody Earl of Douglas said to keep the king's messenger in hand while he cut the head off MacKellen of Bombay in the Thieves' Castle, and that put Steenie mair and mair on his guard. So he spoke up like a man and said he came neither to eat nor drink nor make minstrelsy, but simply for his own, to come what was come of the money he had paid, and to get a discharge for it. And he was so stout-hearted by the time that he charged Sir Robert for conscience sake. He had no power to say the holy name, and as he hoped for peace and rest, to spread no snares for him, but just to give him his ain. Ain means receipt. The appearance gnashed its teeth and laughed, but it took from a large pocket-book the receipt and handed it to Steenie.
"This is your receipt, you pitiful cur, and for the money my dog whelp of a son may go look for it in the cat's cradle."
My guide sire uttered many thanks and was about to retire when Sir Robert roared aloud.
"Stop, thou sack-dowdling son of a... I am not done with thee. Here we do nothing for nothing, and you must return on this very day 12 months to pay your master the homage that you owe me for my protection."
My father's tongue was loosed of a sudden, and he said aloud, "I refer myself to God's pleasure and not to yours." He had no sooner uttered the word that all was dark around him, and he sank on the earth with such a sudden shock that he lost both breath and sense. How long Steenie lay there he could not tell, but when he came to himself he was lying in the old kirkyard of Redgauntlet parish, just at the door of the family ire, and the scutcheon of the old knight Sir Robert hanging over his head. There was a deep morning fog on the grass and the nave stone around him, and his horse was feeding quietly beside the minister's 2 cows. Steenie would have thought the whole was a dream, but he had the receipt in his hand, fairly written and signed by the old lord, only the last letters of his name were a little disorderly, written like one seized with sudden pain. Sorely troubled in his mind, he left that dreary place, rode through the mist to Redgauntlet Castle, and with much ado he got speech of the lard.
"Well, you Devar bankrupt," was the first word. "Have you brought me my rent?"
"No," answered my guide sire, "I have not, but I have brought your honor Sir Robert's receipt for it."
"How, sir? Sir Robert's receipt? You told me he had not given you one. Will your honor please me to see if that bit line is right?"
Sir John looked at every line and at every letter with much attention, and at last the date, which my guide sire had not observed.
"From my appointed place," he read, "this 25th of November. What? That is yesterday. Villain, thou must have gone to hell for this."
"I got it from your honor's father. Whether he be in heaven or hell, I know not."
I will debate you for a warlock to the Privy Council, said Sir John. I will send you to your master the devil with the help of a tar barrel and a torch.
I intend to debate myself to the breastbury, said Steenie, and tell them all I have seen last night. Whilk are things fitter for them to judge of them a borough man like me. Sir John paused, composed himself, and desired to hear the full history, and my guide sire told it to him from point to point, as I have told you, neither more nor less. Sir John was silent again for a long time, and at last he said very composedly,
Steenie, this story of yours concerns the honor of many a noble family besides mine. And if it be a leasing making to keep yourself out of my danger, the least you can expect is to have a red-hot iron driven through your tongue, and that will be as bad as scalding your fingers with a red-hot canter. But yet it may be true. Steenie, and if the money cast up, I shall not know what to think of it. But where shall we find the cat's cradle? There are cats enough about the old house, but I think they kitten without the ceremony of bed or cradle.
And so, Sir John tracks down the one servant who knows where the cat cradle is, and he and Steenie go and find it. And I read again. It was a dangerous place to climb, for the ladder was old and frail and wanted and 1 or 2 rounds. However, up got Sir John and entered at the turret door, where his body stepped the only little light that was in the bit turret. Something flees at him with vengeance. May it dang him over. Bang, gade, a knight's pistol. And Hutchin that held the ladder and my guide sire that stood beside him hear a cry and skellet. A minute later, Sir John flings the body of the jackanate down to them and cries that the silver is found and that they should come up and help him. But there was the bag of silver, sure enough, and money or other things beside it that had gone missing for many a day. And Sir John, when he had ripped the turret wheel, led my guidestone into the dining parlor and took him by the hand and spoke kindly to him and said he was sorry he should have doubted his word and that he would hereafter be a good master to make amends.
And now, Steenie, said Sir John, although this vision of yours tends, on the whole, to my father's credit as an honest man, that he should, even after his death, desire to see justice done to a poor man like you, yet you are sensible that ill-dispositioned men might make bad constructions upon it concerning his soul's health. So I think we had better lay the hail Deirdre on that ill-deedy creature, Major Weir, and say nothing about your dream in the wood of Pitmurky. You had taken over muckle brandy to be very certain about anything. And Steenie, this receipt, his hand shook while he held it out. It's but a queer kind of document, and we will do best, I think, to put it quietly in the fire.
Oh, but as queer as it is, it's the voucher I have for my rent, said the guide sire, who was afraid it might be of losing the benefit of Sir Robert's discharge.
I will bear the contents to your credit in the rental book and give you a discharge under my own hand, said Sir John, and that on the spot. And Steenie, if you can hold your tongue about this matter, you shall sit from this time downward at an easier rent. And so Steenie gets a break on his rent to not tell anybody about the story.
Exactly. And of course, there are 2 more details to take care of, the receipt and Steenie's soul. Sir John wants that receipt burned, and Steenie's worried he's going to go to hell for having gone to hell. So let's read the end of the story.
I will then, said Sir John. If you be so much distressed in mind, you may speak to our minister of the parish. He is a douce man, regards the honor of our family, and the mar that he may look for some patronage from me.
With that, my father readily agreed that the receipt should be burned, and the laird threw it into the chimney with his own hand. Burn it would not for them, though but away it flew up, and with a lang train of sparks at its tail, and a hissing noise like a squig. My guide sire got down to the manse and the minister when he heard the story, and said it was his real opinion that though my guide sire had gone very far in tampering with dangerous matters, yet that he had refused the devil's R's, if such was the offer of meat and drink, and had refused to do homage by piping at his bidding, he hoped that, if he held circumstance walk hereafter, Satan could take little advantage of what had come and gone.
So that means he's off the hook.
He is. And the story would have never been told to anyone, because Sir John blamed the whole thing on the monkey, except after Sir John's death, the minister's wife let the story out of the bag. And here are the final words of the story as Scott tells it. And then my guide sire, what was failed in his limbs and not in his judgment or memory, at least nothing to speak of, was obliged to tell the real narrative to his friends for the credit of his good name. Might else he might have been charged for a warlock. The end.
Well, there it is, one of the first short stories written in the English language, taken right out of Dumfries, Scotland, from stories that circulated about the real life of Sir Robert Grierson. That guy Grierson has certainly left his mark.
As has Sir Walter Scott.
Indeed. Well, thanks for listening. We have enjoyed exploring the history, culture, and the stories of Scotland, and we hope you have too. The link to this narrative in full is going to be on our webpage, howtolovelitpodcast.com. You can read it for yourself in Scots. On our website, you can also find listening guides to all of our podcast episodes. So thank you for supporting the podcast.
Peace out.